Hello everyone and welcome back to my Warhammer 40k guides. I am Brady, and today I wanted to talk about the art of picking secondaries. In the new edition of Warhammer 40k, picking secondaries is a big part of the game and can sometimes be the deciding factor in which player wins. And for a lot of people in the hobby, picking secondaries in Warhammer is a brand new thing because it was only introduced to normal Games Workshop missions in 9th edition. But for players like myself, who played ITC missions for all of 8th edition, secondaries are a thing that I'm used to and understand very well. So in this video, I would like to share some information with you guys on how to pick secondaries that will help your chances of winning 40k games. So with that said, let's get into the main content of this video. Victorious warriors win first and then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first and then seek to win. Sun Tzu from The Art of War. This quote pretty much summarizes my biggest piece of advice when it comes to picking secondaries in Warhammer 40k. And that's because good players usually build their army list to maximize their chances of maxing certain secondaries while being able to limit secondary points for their opponent. This way, they have a massive advantage before the game even begins. Engage on all fronts, while we stand we fight, and deploy Scramblers. These three generic secondaries are, in my opinion, the best and easiest secondaries to build a list around. They all pretty much guarantee 10 plus points if you build your list around them, and you don't have to dedicate very many points of your list to do so. Engage on all fronts and while we stand we fight can easily have lists built around these two, while engage on all fronts and deploy Scramblers can easily have lists built around them, and in some cases, you can make a list that goes for all three of these secondaries every game. If you do this correctly and you build a list that goes for two of these, then you only have to pick one secondary when you actually see your opponent's army across the table from you. And if you manage to build a list that can max out all three of these pretty easily, then you never have to worry about secondaries again. You just show up to your game and play because you already have your plan. So let's talk about these three secondaries and why I think they are so good and easy for almost every army in the game to build around. Engage on all fronts gives you 2 points at the end of your turn if you have a unit in 3 different table quadrants, and 3 points if you have a unit in all 4 table quadrants. This can somewhat easily be done by just including some cheap and fast units into your build alongside your normal army, since your normal army can always cover the 2 quadrants that are on your half of the table, while the few fast units you have can easily cover the other 2 quadrants opposite of yours. For a couple of examples of units that do this well, for Space Marines, you can take 2 or 3 Landspeeder Tempests. Those units can move 20 to 35 inches if they advance, and they have the fly keyword, so they can fly over terrain and units, which means it's incredibly difficult for the opponent to stop these things from flying across the table to grab a quadrant. For armies like Drukhari, you have your Reaver jet bikes, since with their advance, they move 24 inches while having the fly keyword as well. For armies like Chaos Space Marines, you can take Chaos Bikers, which are okay, but not as good as the previous 2 examples, since Chaos Space Marine Bikers don't have the fly keyword, so the opponent can potentially move block them to stop them from doing their job. But even still, they're still a decent pickup for this secondary. If your chosen army doesn't have any units that are cheap and fast, then you can take another route for this secondary with stuff like deep striking units. Raptors for Chaos Space Marine come to mind, Scions for Astra Militarum, pretty much anything Genestealer cults uses, pretty much anything Blood Angels use, Inceptors for other Space Marine chapters, and stuff like that. And if for some reason your army doesn't have cheap and fast units that can move up the board, or cheap deep striking units, you can always spend command points on using the new strategic reserves mechanic to infiltrate some cheap infantry and accomplish the same goal that way, but for a cost of command points. So in that order, that's usually my priority of adding units for this secondary. I go for fast units that I can hide easily on turn 1, pop out and fly across the board to get my points, and I prefer to do this because you start scoring this secondary on turn 1 since those units start on the board. And if for some reason the faction I'm playing can't bring any of those types of units, then I go for the deep striking units, and if I don't have access to any of those deep striking units, I go for strategic reserves with cheap infantry. But with these 2 ways, you only start scoring this secondary on turn 2, which is fine, but it's obviously better to start scoring it on turn 1. You can also take a mix of units that do each. Take one unit that you can hide on turn 1 and fly up the board on turn 1 to score this secondary on turn 1, and then take some deep striking units that you can bring in on turn 2 and turn 3 to score this secondary on those turns. Mix and match and find what you prefer based on your own playstyle. A rule of thumb I usually go by is I only want to spend somewhere between 200 to 350 points for units dedicated to scoring this secondary. That way I still have a ton of points left over to make an actual army that can hold objectives and kill enemy units. You can also try to do this secondary with stuff like aircrafts and flyers, but those units tend to be pretty expensive, and if you get unlucky and lose first turn, there's a chance that your opponent just blows them out of the sky turn 1, and then you've kind of lost those units. So with the cheaper units, they're usually much smaller and easier to hide. So they usually survive so that you can actually get to use them on your turn 1. Also, instead of bringing a couple of expensive units, if you bring 3 or 4 cheap units, you can use one of those units turn 1, fly it up the board, get your points for the secondary, and sure, on the following turn, it will most likely die a horrible death, but then on turn 2, you got one of his buddies to take his place, and then score this secondary on turn 2, and then when he dies a horrible death, then on turn 3, you have his other buddy. And by that point, the rest of your army should be in position to just move into each quadrant themselves. And alongside that reason, there's another reason why I don't like using big expensive units to accomplish this secondary, and that's because While We Stand We Fight is an amazing secondary to build around alongside this secondary. While We Stand We Fight is a secondary that has you pick the 3 most expensive models in your army, and yes, it's models, not units. And for each one of those models that lives to the end of the game, you score 5 points for a maximum of 15 points if all 3 survive. The easiest way to build for this secondary is to have 3 characters that have less than 10 wounds be your most expensive models in your army. This is because it's incredibly difficult for your opponent to kill those characters due to the lookout sir rule, and because you probably have a ton of infantry in front of them to block for them. And even if your opponent has weapons like snipers that ignore the lookout sir rule so they can target your characters, you can always just hide those characters behind a piece of terrain that has the obscuring rule. Admittedly, this secondary is kind of anti-fun because it forces you to play like a little bitch with those 3 characters, so you can't really do stuff like charging in heroically with your captain unless you're 100% sure you can keep him safe afterwards. Or I guess if you're cool with losing 5 points, you can charge in with him heroically and kill some stuff and give him up, so that's an option as well. But for the most part, you kind of want to play conservative with these 3 characters so you can max out this secondary. But I mean, if winning is your primary goal, then this secondary is by far your best chance of winning if you build a good list around it, especially if you also simultaneously built your list around Engage on all fronts. So for those 3 characters, your best bet is to go with characters that aren't necessarily meant for combat, but characters that instead just support your army through auras or other abilities, so you still make use of them. For example, in Space Marines, you can take an Indominus Captain for the rerolls. You can also take an Indominus Lieutenant for the rerolls as well. And then for the third character, you can either take an upgraded Apothecary, a Chaplain, or a Librarian, depending on the rest of your build and what you're going for. If, however, your army doesn't have any good supporting characters, and instead only really has characters that you want to make use of in combat, then don't go for this secondary and do something else instead. But if you do manage to build a list around While We Stand We Fight and Engage on all fronts at the same time, that's an easy 20 to 30 points between those 2 secondaries against pretty much any army. And the last secondary that I think is worth building your list around is Deploy Scramblers. Deploy Scramblers gives you 10 points at the end of the game if you successfully complete the Deploy Scramblers action 3 times during the battle. Once in your deployment zone, once in the enemy deployment zone, and once in an area on the board that's at least 6 inches away from each player's deployment zone. So basically, you have an infantry unit give up their shooting and melee to deploy Scramblers in those 3 spots. And you can do it with 3 different infantry units, so it doesn't have to be one hero unit doing it all. So I think this secondary works best in armies that can easily spam a ton of cheap infantry in cheap transports, or if they can just spam a ton of cheap infantry. This is because if you're using expensive infantry that you're relying on for doing damage, you don't really want to give up their shooting or combat for a turn. But for a unit of 10 guardsmen or 5 servitors or 5 racks that aren't really going to do that much damage by themselves anyways, then sure, I am totally willing to give up their damage potential in order to score some victory points. The armies that come to mind that are great for this secondary are Drukhari, Craftworlds, Harlequins, Astra Militarum, Adeptus Mechanicus, Genestealer Cults, and Sisters of Battle. These armies aren't that great for building around While We Stand We Fight because their characters are actually stupidly cheap, and in those armies you usually want to bring some vehicles, which are almost always going to be your most expensive units and obviously more expensive than your characters. And you don't ever want to take While We Stand We Fight when you have units that the enemy can just target with shooting because they exist on the table. For example, stuff like tank commanders and Astra Militarum. Your opponent already wants to and can shoot those things off the table without restriction, so don't give them any more reason to. So for these armies, we replace While We Stand We Fight with Deploy Scramblers because it's much more safe and consistent. This secondary can only score either 0 points or 10 points, so it's either you do it or you don't. But with these armies, unless you really get outplayed or you're just bad at the game, this secondary gets you 10 points every game. The idea is have a couple of cheap foot slogging units start on the board turn 1. Have one of them deploy Scramblers in your own deployment, and one of them deploy Scramblers just outside of your deployment. Then at some point, you make your way up the board with some transports full of infantry, and when you can, pop out one of your infantry units in the enemy deployment zone, and boom, 10 points. You can also accomplish this secondary pretty easily with deep striking infantry, so stuff like Scions for Astra Militarum, or Scourges for Drukhari, stuff like that. Or you can pay some command points to put a couple of cheap infantry and strategic reserves and accomplish this goal as well, stuff like Chaos Cultist or even Space Marine Servitors. This is why this secondary pretty much goes hand in hand with Engage on All Fronts as well, because if you combine both of these secondaries at the same time, you can use the same units to accomplish both, without dedicating too many points to either. You can definitely max out this secondary as well with other more elite armies such as Space Marines or Chaos Space Marines, but I think this secondary is slightly more suited for the armies I mentioned previously. But the golden list, the best lists in my opinion, make use of all three of these secondaries that I just went over. Because all three of those secondaries don't care about what army your opponent is playing, they only care about what army and build that you are playing. And there isn't too much counterplay to any of these secondaries either, which is the best part. So if you can make a list using the advice from this video that has potential to max out all three of these previously mentioned secondaries, you'll never have to worry about actually having to think about picking secondaries when you play a game of 40k, because you already know what you're going to take every single game. So with that said, if your army or your collection of models doesn't allow you to build an optimal list that can easily max out all three of those secondaries at the same time, your best bet is to at least build around two of those secondaries and pick what I call a filler secondary every game for your third secondary. So your best bets are Engage on All Fronts and While We Stand We Fight plus a filler secondary, or Engage on All Fronts and deploy Scramblers and a filler secondary. And I think it's pretty obvious, but I'll say it anyways. For your third secondary, you almost always want to pick the secondary that you can realistically get the most points possible for. And so I guess some advice on filler secondaries that you can pick. Let's go over some of the filler secondaries that I would pick and when I would pick them. Thin their ranks. If you went with Engage on All Fronts and deploy Scramblers, and if you're up against something like a Tyranic Gaunt Horde that has over 200 easily killable bodies, this is a decent filler secondary if you have the firepower to kill at least 150 of those bodies over 5 turns. That's the important part. Only pick this if you're confident you have the shots and attacks needed to kill 150 of those Gaunts or Orc Boys or whatever horde you're playing against. Because if you can't, then you should probably pick another secondary that will be more reliable in giving you max points. That's actually a problem that I've noticed with a lot of newer players, is they'll see a horde across the table from them and instantly be like, oh, Thin Their Ranks is a great secondary to take. But they don't really realize that their list isn't capable of killing that many bodies over 5 turns. So don't fall into that trap. Only take a secondary like this or Bring It Down, which will be the next one I talk about. Only take those secondaries if you're absolutely confident that you have the proper firepower to deal the damage needed to max out these secondaries. Because you gotta remember too, let's say you're playing Space Marines and you have one unit of 6 aggressors that you're absolutely confident will just nuke a bunch of Gaunts in a single turn. Well, if that's your only anti-horde unit, and if your opponent's smart and they have something like Hiveguard, if they kill those aggressors turn 1 or turn 2, well, now your anti-horde is severely diminished, so you're probably not going to kill as many models as you originally thought. So this will come with time and experience, but you're going to have to look at both lists and try to think of how the game is going to play out and try to figure out if your firepower is going to last long enough through the 5 turns in order to be able to score these secondaries. Bring It Down. This is your filler secondary if your opponent has a bunch of vehicles that your list can efficiently kill, which I kind of previously talked about with the Thin Your Ranks secondary. And realistically, your list should be able to take down a minimum of 5 vehicles during a 5-turn game. Otherwise, you should probably remake your list with a bit more anti-tank. Assassinate. This is a good filler secondary, but only if your opponent has a minimum of 3 beatstick characters that you 100% know that they are going to want to throw in your face for some combat. The reason I say that is because if they are going for something like you with While We Stand We Fight, or if they are just using supporting characters that are going to stay in the back all game, they can just play like little bitches and run and hide from your stuff for most of the game. And this will hurt your score while not really hurting theirs. But if they have some beatstick characters that they are relying on to do some damage, then I think it's okay to pick this as your filler secondary because you give them a choice. They can use their characters the way they originally intended while potentially helping you score victory points for killing them, or they can play defensive with those characters, but they'll get less damage done over the game because they were relying on them to do damage. Either option is good for you in this instance. You either get some victory points because they threw the stuff in your face, or you lose less of your army because they didn't throw the stuff in your face. And if that's the case, then that will help you get more points in other areas of the game like primary scoring, because over the course of the 5-turn game, your army is slowly going to look a lot bigger than theirs, which will make it easier to win the primary scoring. So it's a win-win in my opinion. But again, I gotta stress this, just because they have 6 characters doesn't mean Assassinate is a good pick. Only pick it if you think that those characters are going to be easy for you to kill. If you think that they're going to be able to run and hide all game, don't pick this secondary because you'll probably only end up with like 3 or 6 or 0 points. Raise the banners. If you didn't pick Deploy Scramblers, this is a decent alternative. I find this secondary only works when you have a very sturdy force that can keep the opponent's army back and away from your banners. This secondary is amazing if you're playing a mission that you can place 3 banners on turn 1, while then protecting them for the rest of the game by pushing your opponent back into their own deployment. This secondary is still decent if you can only place 2 flags turn 1, but then you're not going to max it out. You need 3 objectives turn 1 to easily max this out. But like I said earlier, you're mainly just trying to get a minimum of 9 points from each of your secondaries, so if you think you can do that, then this secondary is a decent pickup. The reason I prefer Deploy Scramblers over Raise the Banners is because there is less counterplay to Deploy Scramblers than there is to Raise the Banners. So even though Deploy Scramblers only gives a maximum of 10, while Raise the Banners gives a maximum of 15, Raise the Banners has more counterplay for your opponent than Deploy Scramblers does, which means Deploy Scramblers is going to be a more consistent secondary to go with most of the time depending on your build. And consistency is what we want in competitive Warhammer 40k because there's already too much RNG in this game, so we want to try to limit RNG and just keep it to consistency. Abhor the Witch. This is a very situational filler secondary since it requires you to have 0 psychers in your own army, and also because this secondary is only good against a couple of armies in the game. I would only pick this secondary when up against Grey Knights or Thousand Suns, and that's pretty much it. You can make an argument to pick it against other armies that spam psychers like Tyranids or Craft Worlds, but realistically, you'll probably only score 6 points if your opponent plays defensively with those units, and a good player would do exactly that. But against Grey Knights and Thousand Suns, well, pretty much every single one of their units is a psycher, and unless the person playing that army wants to hide every unit in their army for the entire game, then this secondary is just free real estate. And the final filler secondary to talk about is Mental Interrogation. I would only pick this secondary if you have a psycher in your list, which I think is obvious, but I'll say it anyways, and only if you think you can keep your psycher safe while being able to perform the interrogations, which shouldn't be too hard unless your opponent has a bunch of firepower that ignores the lookout sir rule like sniper rifles. You can't really rely on hiding behind a wall either for this secondary, because if you do, your opponent can usually just back out of your 18-inch range with all their characters, which will force you to have to move towards them, and if they do have a bunch of weapons that ignore lookout sir, then you're just going to get blasted off the table before you can score max points for this. With that said, that's kind of why I prefer this secondary over Psychic Ritual, is because you can at least score 3 or 6 or 9 points with this secondary, and it's not an all or nothing type secondary like Psychic Ritual is. Because for Psychic Ritual, sure, you only have to cast a spell 3 times in the center of the board, but what if you lose control of the center of the board before you can accomplish that goal? Well, now you're getting 0 points for that secondary. Or what if you get unlucky and your psycher dies to perils or something like that? Well, now you're getting 0 points for that secondary. So at least with Mental Interrogation, it's the safer bet of the two because you can at least get 3 or 6 or 9 points instead of just all or nothing. And with that said, the only time I would ever pick this filler secondary is if my opponent has 0 psychic defense. And in today's meta, most armies do have psychic defense, so to be honest, this is most likely going to be the secondary that you pick the least, if you even do ever pick it. But I mean, in some matchups against armies that have 0 psychic defense, then this is a decent secondary to pick because there isn't that much counterplay to it other than them moving their characters farther away from you. But kind of like how we were talking about Assassinate earlier, if they're moving their characters farther away from you, they're probably moving other units farther away from you as well, which means you're taking control of more of the board than they are. So in those type of matchups, you can use this secondary as well, not necessarily to score points, but just to force your opponent to walk backwards or give you more points. So in those matchups, this could be a decent secondary. And those are the filler secondaries to take as your third secondary choice if you weren't able to build a list that can easily score engage on all fronts, while we stand we fight, and deploy scramblers at the same time. So before I end this video, I have two last pieces of advice when it comes to secondaries. The first is that with the new edition of the Space Marines and Necron codexes for 9th edition, we now know that Games Workshop is adding in faction-specific secondary choices for each faction in their codexes. Some of these secondary choices are probably going to be pretty easy to build a list around. For example, the secondary No Mercy, No Respite for Space Marines is a great secondary to build your list around if you don't want to build around While We Stand We Fight. So make sure to take a look at your codex and see which secondaries are available for your army and see if they are worth building a list around alongside other secondaries like Engage on All Fronts, While We Stand We Fight, or Deploy Scramblers. And the second and last piece of advice I have when it comes to secondaries, it's again when you're building your list, because you want as many advantages as you can get before even placing your models on a table for a game, and you want a game plan going into that game. And that piece of advice is to try and make lists that don't easily give up max points for secondaries to the opponent. For examples, the two biggest culprits are Assassinate and Bring It Down. If you want to play a Nidzilla list like 10 Carnifexes, then prepare to give away max points for Bring It Down. Or if you're playing a Hero Hammer list with a bunch of characters, then be prepared to give away max points for Assassinate. And if your opponent followed this guide video and built their list to be able to max out Engage on All Fronts and While We Stand We Fight, or Engage on All Fronts and Deploy Scramblers, then you better hope you outplay them and win on the primary, otherwise they're probably going to win the secondary game when their filler secondary gives them max points because of the way you decided to build your list. So as a rule of thumb, I try my best to build lists that only give away at max 9 points for secondaries, which means I would only include 3 characters at most, because for Assassinate that means even if they kill all 3, they only get 9 points. And when it comes to vehicles, I would only include 4 vehicles with 11 or less wounds and no other vehicles, or 3 big vehicles with 12 or more wounds. This way they're not going to get max points for Bring It Down either. For some armies, it's actually very easy to accomplish this, but for other armies, it's kind of impossible, which is kind of unfortunate. For example, Drukhari pretty much always gives up 10 plus points for Bring It Down. It's kind of inevitable because you're most likely going to have 4 or more Venoms with a couple of other vehicles like Ravagers or Reapers. So yeah, you just kind of got to take it on the chin with that army and hope that you win the primary. But for some other armies, for example, Space Marines, you can easily make a list that's mostly all infantry and only include like 3 characters and a couple of vehicles like Landspeeder Storms for your Engage on All Fronts tech choice. That type of list will usually always have an advantage, because when you do go up against people that don't watch this video and don't plan ahead, and when they see that army across the table from them, they'll look through all the secondary choices in the book and slowly realize they aren't going to be able to max out any of those secondaries. And so with that, we come back to the quote that started this video. Victorious warriors win first and then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first and then seek to win. And that's going to be it for this video. If you enjoyed it or learned something from it, hit that like button to let me know and I'll make some more content like this. Also, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon to be notified when I make new videos like this. I'm trying to go back to the channel's roots, and I'm planning on making a bunch of more guide videos to help you all out with your 40k game. So if you want that edge against your friends, or you just want to improve your chances of doing well at tournaments, then make sure to subscribe. Also, if you want some more in-depth coaching or even a custom list built by myself so you don't have to worry about making one, those are rewards that I offer over on Patreon. Patreon is the main source of income for this channel, and it's what keeps my bills paid. There are many different rewards, like the ones previously mentioned, and also others like exclusive access to the Almost Pro Gaming Discord server, where you can chat with myself and other players who have either won or done well at GT or major events. It's a great resource for anyone who wants to improve their 40k game, or for someone who just wants some people to talk about 40k with. We have die-hard competitive players, like previously mentioned, but we also have regular hobbyists, basically every type of 40k player you can think of. And it's only $5 a month, so incredibly cheap for what you get in return. So check out the Patreon page if you want to help support the channel further outside of watching my videos, or if you just want to benefit from some of the rewards. With that said, thanks to all my past and current patrons. You guys and gals are awesome, and I love you all. And thanks to all you regular viewers as well. I'm glad you all enjoy the content and keep coming back for more. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next video. Happy wargaming.